Fireworks explode overhead. Lanterns shimmer and sway above laughing crowds. Smiling faces fill the streets of Saigon, and hundreds of South Vietnamese soldiers mingle around, their rifles set aside for Tet, the Lunar New Year. In the middle of it all stands an American soldier, still and uneasy. He scans the street. Something isn't right. Then, beneath the fireworks, he hears a sharp crack. Not from the sky, from the ground. He turns, but all he sees are the people around as they keep on cheering. Suddenly, the ground shudders as an explosion rips through the streets. Panic erupts. Soldiers, civilians, and children start running in every direction. This isn't possible. The enemy is dug in near the border, days away. Then he sees it. A man in civilian clothes standing idle among the chaos, eyes locked on him. He starts to approach, pulling out a rifle from beneath his coat. The soldier understands. They're not coming. They're already among them. America goes to war. By 1964, the situation in Vietnam had turned dire. Nearly a decade had passed since the conflict started between the North and the South, yet no end was in sight. Across the globe, American President Lyndon B. Johnson stared at battlefield maps with anxious eyes. Since inheriting the presidency after John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Johnson had juggled two monumental tasks: lifting America at home and holding back communism abroad. Vietnam, however, refused to bend. Each day, North Vietnamese forces, armed and empowered by China and the Soviet Union, pressed harder against South Vietnam's defenses. Johnson feared the collapse of Saigon would trigger a chain reaction across Southeast Asia. Yet he couldn't risk full escalation, not before securing his presidency in the upcoming 1964 election. However, the call to war was already brewing off the coast of Vietnam. On patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, USS Maddox, an American destroyer on an intelligence-gathering mission, caught the attention of North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Engines worked at maximum capacity, and a high-speed chase ignited across the waves. Maddox fought back, firing her guns as she maneuvered to escape. American aircraft quickly descended onto the scene, unleashing strafing runs that forced the attackers to scatter. Maddox returned unharmed, but tensions had hit a boiling point. Still, Johnson held his nerve. Instead of leaping into war, his administration issued a warning to Hanoi. Another unprovoked attack, and North Vietnamese forces would be met with force. 2 days later, on the night of August 4th, Maddox, accompanied by USS Turner Joy, sailed near the North Vietnamese coast late at night. Suddenly, their radar and sonar lit up. Unidentified signals echoed across the consoles. Blips of potential torpedo boats surrounded them, and they were closing fast. The American destroyers opened fire, cutting the sea with shells as they executed evasive maneuvers, retreating southward through the fog. In Washington, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara delivered the news to Johnson, quote, "Mr. President, we just had word from Admiral Sharp that the destroyer is under torpedo attack." But as the reports poured in, the picture blurred. The crew aboard Maddox couldn't confirm any hits. No records surfaced, and no enemy boats were clearly identified. Yet scattered intelligence suggested that enemy planes may have been shot down, the only hint of a potential North Vietnamese offensive. Despite the obscurity of the alleged attack, Johnson could no longer ignore the conflict. The measured restraint he'd clung to throughout the election cycle crumbled. Now, he had to show strength. Stalemate. On August 5th, 1964, Douglas A-4 Skyhawks and A-1 Sky Raiders took off from the USS Ticonderoga and USS Constellation, slicing toward their targets. With the coastlines in sight, they unleashed their payloads, hammering nearly 30 enemy torpedo boats and gunboats. It was the first large-scale American airstrike against North Vietnam. Back home, Lyndon B. Johnson secured his presidency with a landslide election, ensuring that the war campaign in Vietnam would carry on unchallenged. By 1965, the skies above Southeast Asia darkened as swarms of American warplanes began to descend on Vietnam. On the ground, the jungles trembled beneath the boots of nearly 200,000 U.S. troops, their fleets loaded to the brim with weapons designed to crush the enemy. The plan was simple: hit them hard and fast, giving them no time to fight back. Johnson and his general, William Westmoreland, were convinced that a swift victory was in order. In March, the real war began, with hundreds of American bombers lifting off runways and heading straight to roads, bridges, oil depots, radar installations, MiG air bases, and the vital Ho Chi Minh Trail. The goal was total destruction, severing North Vietnam's lifelines and crushing its ability to wage war. This was the largest sustained bombing campaign of the Cold War. Over 150,000 sorties rained down 864,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, dwarfing any single Allied bombing campaign of World War II. Explosions lit up the jungles, turning supply lines into nothing but ashes. Yet, to America's shock, North Vietnam did not bend. Soviet-supplied MiG fighters, SAM missiles, and lethal flak zones ripped through the skies, blasting American aircraft by the hundreds. U.S. pilots suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives, dodging radar-guided missile strikes, outmaneuvering aerial ambushes, and bailing out into hostile territory. And on the ground, the situation was no better. At Ia Drang Valley, the war's first major land battle ignited. U.S. battalions, flown in by helicopter air assault, landed directly into the jaws of an enemy who'd been waiting for them. Surrounded and cut off, they fought to survive under waves of People's Army of Vietnam soldiers, or the PRVN, who closed the distance fast and engaged in close-quarter battles and guerrilla tactics, which quickly neutralized America's edge. By 1967, Johnson's hopes of a swift victory had crumbled. The U.S. troop count ballooned to over 500,000 men, but progress stalled. The enemy was always one step ahead. Deception Campaign. As 1968 rolled along, North Vietnam's war planners began sharpening their knives for what they hoped could be the definitive hit to crush America and its allies. At the forefront of this plan stood Le Duan, the hardline General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. For Duan, the path to victory demanded a coordinated strike that would ignite the South Vietnamese population into open rebellion and drive the Americans out of their country. Duan proposed a sweeping offensive that would stretch from the Mekong Delta to the gates of Saigon. He planned to seize South Vietnam before the Americans could catch their breath. The offensive would be launched during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Traditionally, this holiday was a time of ceasefire, with soldiers on both sides laying down their arms to spend time with their families. But not this year. The communists would turn the sacred holiday into a weapon, exploiting the lull in vigilance to unleash an attack that would blindside the enemy. In the months leading up to the attack, North Vietnamese forces staged a series of battles along South Vietnam's distant borders, starting firefights in remote outposts like Dak To and Con Thien. These clashes were never meant to win territory. They were bait, set to lure American commanders into believing the war's next chapter would unfold far from the cities. General William Westmoreland took the bait. Convinced that the communists were massing for a push along the border, he shifted half of his maneuver battalions away from urban strongholds like Saigon and Hue, leaving the cities vulnerable. Then came the infiltration. In the weeks before Tet, Viet Cong operatives snuck into the urban centers, slipping through checkpoints in civilian clothes, armed with forged papers, posing as farmers and laborers returning home for the holiday, while carrying AK-47s and B-40 rocket launchers, hidden in sacks of rice stacked within trucks. Once inside, they mixed with the locals, mapping out streets, marking targets, and noting weaknesses in the city's defenses. American and South Vietnamese troops had no idea that enemy squads were already among them, primed to strike from within. The sky turns red. Late on January 30th, 1968, as the final hours of the old Lunar Year ticked away, an order arrived to the PAVN and Viet Cong forces stationed in South Vietnam, quote, "Crack the sky, shake the earth." In the coastal city of Nha Trang, mortar shells and rocket fire rained down on the U.S. 1st Field Force headquarters. Explosions tore through the compound's outer defenses, shattering walls and igniting fires. In the chaos, North Vietnamese sappers and local VC forces struck hard, their AK-47s crackling as they sought to breach the perimeter. Nha Trang was only the beginning. The same scene unfolded across 36 of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals. Dozens of cities ripped from their celebrations as enemy battalions stormed through, assault rifles barking, explosions tearing apart government compounds and military installations. Yet amid the carnage, there was one flicker of hope. The attacks in some cities, triggered prematurely by eager commanders, gave away the larger game plan. In the province of Ho Chi Minh, an officer barked into a field telephone as he reported back to Westmoreland, quote, This is going to happen in the rest of the country tonight and tomorrow morning. The words hit General William Westmoreland like a gut punch. The scope of the attack was bigger than anything he could have anticipated, and if his men didn't act quickly, the war would be lost in a single night. Frantic, he ordered a maximum alert across the entire theater, relaying desperate warnings to every command post in South Vietnamese leadership. But the warning came too late. Tet was only hours away, and many ARVN troops were already on leave, scattered among their families, their rifles abandoned for the holiday. In Saigon, the city hummed with lantern light and festive parades. Civilians filled the streets, gazing at the sky as fireworks erupted above them. But as these bursts of color lit the sky, another sound joined the chorus. Low, muffled at first, then unmistakable. Gunfire. New Year, same war. Just before dawn, a blast detonated right next to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Viet Cong sappers had blown through the 8-foot-high perimeter wall around the building and stormed in, armed to the teeth. Firing at anything that moved, they gunned down diplomats, military guards, and anyone unlucky enough to cross their line of fire. They were determined to seize the embassy and shatter American morale, no matter the cost. But before they could force their way into the chancery, American reinforcements descended from the sky. Helicopters hovered above the embassy roof, deploying security forces and infantry, rifles blazing downward into the courtyard below. A firefight erupted between the embassy walls. The Viet Cong, pinned down, tried to hold their ground, but one by one they were hunted and cut down. By sunrise, all 19 sappers had either been neutralized or captured. However, the attack had only just begun. As gunfire went off at the embassy, waves of North Vietnamese troops surged towards some of Saigon's most critical buildings. A group of fighters stormed the Radio Saigon headquarters, Tai Son Nut Air Base, the ARVN Joint General Staff, and even Independence Palace. Victory seemed to be within reach. At Radio Saigon, a squad of Viet Cong fighters broke through the lobby in a hail of bullets, dragging with them a tape recording of Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam's president, ready to broadcast the liberation of the South. However, as the invaders captured the station, they quickly realized that South Vietnamese engineers had cut the studio's transmission lines. Now, they could only barricade themselves inside, waiting for reinforcements. This pattern repeated across the city. North Vietnamese forces seized footholds, barracks, offices, and command centers, but instead of meeting a submissive population, they faced fierce resistance everywhere they turned. By abandoning guerrilla warfare to fight a traditional urban battle, the North Vietnamese had entered a whole new arena, one ruled by their enemy. But all they could do was stick to the plan and keep fighting. At Cholon, Saigon's Chinese quarter, Viet Cong units turned alleyways into ambush sites and apartment blocks into fortresses. Civilians fled as ARVN Rangers and U.S. infantry declared Cholon a free fire zone, turning the neighborhood into a war zone. House-to-house combat raged on, with walls blasted apart by grenades and snipers lurking at every window. However, even if the Americans could stand up against their enemies, nearly 20 Viet Cong battalions still prowled Saigon's outskirts, ready to strike. Armed with blacklists, they targeted key officials, military officers, and civilians, executing collaborators wherever they found them. The massacre spread across the region. The citadel falls. As Saigon succumbed to enemy gunfire, flares began to shoot into the black sky above Hue, Vietnam's former capital, opening the assault upon the ancient imperial city. Almost instantly, a hailstorm of mortars and rockets began hammering the western walls of the citadel. Through the smoke, PAVN infantry surged forward, assault rifles blazing, determined to break through and seize the headquarters of the ARVN 1st Division stationed within. While the defenders scrambled to repel this brutal frontal assault, another charge was taking place across the city. At the Chan Tai Gate, a team of North Vietnamese sappers, disguised in stolen ARVN uniforms, crept in. They snuck up on the unsuspecting guards, silencing them with their weapons before they could sound the alarm. In a single motion, the gate swung open, and waves of PAVN infantry poured into the citadel, rifles at the ready. House by house, the PAVN swept through Hue, turning every alley into a battleground. ARVN troops, cut off and vastly outnumbered, mounted last stands behind crumbling walls and sandbag courtyards. By sunrise, North Vietnamese flags fluttered over the citadel's towers. In the light of day, a U.S. Army helicopter hovered over the shattered skyline of Hue. From the cockpit, the crew scanned the streets below, searching for gaps in the enemy's grip, trying to plan the next move in their counterattack. Before they could finish their assessment, a flash burst from the ground and a shell slammed into the fuselage. The impact tore through the helicopter's frame, spinning it wildly out of control. The bird pitched sideways, plunging toward the maze of alleyways below. The crew on board barely had time to escape and seek refuge. Retaking the city seemed impossible, and as North Vietnamese defenders kept on pushing to expel the invaders from the city, PAVN paramilitary units only tightened their hold on Hue, ambushing and cutting off every ARVN relief convoy approaching the citadel. For the Marines trapped inside the city, the situation was no better. The streets belonged to the enemy, with every intersection turned into a strike zone and every rooftop crawling with snipers. To survive, the Marines had to adopt urban warfare tactics. They detonated C4 charges to blast through walls. Torch-wielding flamethrowers lit up darkened corridors, and bazookas blew gaping holes through barricades, allowing the Americans to avoid the open streets. However, the fight would still find them. Firefights erupted inside government offices, schoolhouses, and temples, where Marines and PAVN soldiers exchanged gunfire across desks, pews, and chalkboards. A somber victory. After 4 weeks of battle, American Marines and South Vietnamese troops finally saw a breakthrough upon launching a final push from their foothold in the southern ruins of Hue, rallying around the battered MAC-B compound, one of the last Allied strongholds in the area. Army trucks, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, rumbled through the rubble-filled streets, flanked by M50 Ontos vehicles, their 6 recoilless rifles blasting holes through enemy bunkers and sniper nests. When enemy fire became too intense, the Marines turned to tear gas, releasing choking clouds that billowed down alleyways and masked their movement. Under that cover, squads would dash across open streets, charging through shattered doorways before the PAVN could regroup. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese airborne and Marine battalions stormed the northern citadel. Heavy artillery pounded enemy positions, sending chunks of ancient stonework flying as the ARVN clawed their way toward the heart of the fortress, the Imperial Palace. But orders came down. The palace walls could not be shelled. Its cultural and historical value was too great. The South Vietnamese had to lead slow, battling through courtyards and narrow corridors until the PAVN yielded each room. By February 21st, the South Vietnamese flag flew once more atop the citadel. The last pockets of PAVN resistance were wiped out by ARVN Rangers and the American 5th Cavalry, clearing their last holdout with mortar barrages and artillery strikes. The casualties were too big to ignore. The PAVN had lost over 5,000 men, and with the hope of holding the city vanishing before them, their commanders ordered a retreat into the jungle, leaving behind their fallen and the promise of an uprising that would send the South Vietnamese crumbling down. Over at Saigon, weapons were laid down as well. The Tet Offensive had officially failed, and the Americans had managed to keep the enemy at bay. But victory came at a high price. Entire neighborhoods across South Vietnam had been obliterated, historic temples and homes reduced to ashes, and the human toll was tragic. More than 100,000 soldiers and civilians had lost their lives, been wounded, or gone missing. In the ruins of Hue, mass graves were uncovered, a result of the PAVN-led massacres aimed at neutralizing anyone deemed loyal to the South Vietnamese government. This had been one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, and the world could no longer look away. Face of war. As the Tet Offensive collapsed, South Vietnamese troops scoured the streets of Saigon, rounding up the remnants of the Viet Cong who had failed to seize the capital. Among the prisoners was one man whose face would go around the world. His name was Nguyen Van Lem, a Viet Cong captain captured by the police. As South Vietnamese troops began to question him, they immediately understood he wasn't just another soldier. He was the mastermind behind some of the Viet Cong's most heinous crimes, including the cold-blooded execution of ARVN officers and their families. When General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, the commander of Saigon's police force, stood face-to-face with Lem, he could not hide his rage. Loan had been told that the man shackled before him was responsible for the loss of one of his closest friends, a fellow officer, and his entire family, along with Loan's 6 godchildren. It didn't matter if Lem was responsible for the crime he was accused of or not. He wouldn't get a trial. Not in South Vietnam. Surrounded by soldiers and reporters, General Lone drew his .38 caliber revolver and without hesitation fired a single shot. Eddie Adams, an American photojournalist with the Associated Press, captured the moment. General Lone's reputation was shattered forever, and the image would follow him for the rest of his days. Comeback. Before President Johnson could even rethink his Vietnam strategy, another campaign was already brewing in the jungle. North Vietnamese forces, defeated but unbroken after the first Tet Offensive, were determined to strike again. The initial offensive may have fallen short, but Hanoi's leadership wasn't ready to abandon the plan. Instead, they would try to replicate the attack of Tet, striking the enemy right within their territory over and over again. On April 29, 1968, just weeks after the last assault, a full PAVN division surged south, targeting the region just north of Dong Ha, the strategic gateway to Quang Tri Province. U.S. Marines and ARVN defenders braced themselves as the enemy swept in. Gunfire ripped through the air, the crack of AK-47s and M16s echoing for hours. The North Vietnamese weren't satisfied with the borderlands. They set their sights on Saigon once again. Rocket fire rained down on the Newport Bridge, tearing into the defenders, while Viet Cong sappers, disguised in Marine uniforms, crept through the outskirts, trying to infiltrate the city. In the western districts of Saigon, the Viet Cong kept on striking through June, weaving through sewers, slipping through ruined buildings, and emerging from the rubble to ambush patrols. This time, however, the defenders were ready. As the Viet Cong emerged from cover, UH-1 Huey gunships unleashed torrents of machine gun fire, artillery batteries lit up the streets, and the invaders were driven back. By May 30th, more than 3,000 Viet Cong lives had been lost in Saigon. The city, still scarred from the Tet Offensive, was left in ruins once again. But while the Americans and ARVN held the line, a grim realization began to settle. No matter how many times they beat back the enemy, the North Vietnamese would always return, replenished and ready to strike again. Barely a month passed before the North Vietnamese returned, launching a third wave in what would be known as the August Offensive. This time, their strategy shifted. They targeted key military installations, aiming to cripple U.S. communications and wipe entire columns before they could fight back. Rocket fire streaked over Saigon once more, smashing into the National Assembly building. Civilian casualties mounted. General Creighton Abrams, one of the American commanders, understood that the enemy would not quit, stating, quote, "The Viet Cong have become prisoners of their own damn strategy. They can't find a way out, and they can't admit it." As long as they had breath left to fight, the North Vietnamese forces would keep attacking. The price of victory. 1968 closed with American and South Vietnamese forces standing victorious but badly scarred. The North Vietnamese failed to achieve their objectives during the Tet Offensive, yet the price of the loss was too high to ignore. The war's future looked grim for Washington and its allies. South Vietnam lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, villages burned, and the countryside riddled with craters and clandestine graveyards. And while the enemy had been repelled on the battlefield, morale had been lost. That same year, American and North Vietnamese leaders faced each other in Paris for peace talks. But the U.S. no longer held the upper hand. Washington agreed to gradually withdraw its troops and suspend the bombing campaigns that had failed to crush the enemy's resolve. At home, the American public had turned against the war. The haunting images of the Tet Offensive became engraved in their conscience. Vietnam was seen as a hopeless war. As 1969 approached, the political fallout became undeniable. Another presidential election loomed. Crushed beneath the weight of the war he had escalated, Johnson bowed out, recognizing that his presidency and the war were unsalvageable. The burden of Vietnam would then fall on his successor, Richard Nixon. American troops began training South Vietnamese forces, trying to prepare them for the inevitable day when they would stand alone. That day came on March 29, 1973, as the last American combat troops boarded planes and ships, leaving the war-torn nation behind. By the spring of 1975, North Vietnamese troops marched through the gates of Saigon once more. This time, there were no U.S. Marines, no Hueys overhead, no last-ditch defense. South Vietnam crumbled, and the flag of the Viet Cong flew over the presidential palace.